really see herself growing old with him? And hadn't he waited for her when she told him she needed time to sort things out? Annie let out a moan of indecision. She thought she had sorted things out. So why had she awakened on her wedding day feeling as though it was all a mistake? "Wait," Celia said. "You love him, don't you? Tell me you love him." "I love him." "Then what's the problem?" Annie sighed heavily. "There may be someone else." "It's not because of—" Celia nodded toward the headstone. "Is it? Because if that's the case—" Annie laughed. "No, Keith's place in my heart is secure. It's someone else." "And you think you're in love with this other man?" Annie's hands flopped at her sides. "No." "No?" "Well, maybe." "Maybe? That's just it. I don't know. I haven't known him long enough to know. But it's not fair to stand for me to marry him as long as there's a doubt in my mind, is it?" Annie plopped down onto the grass beside her husband's grave. Grass stain warnings flashed in her mind. She didn't care. She'd worry about that later. Celia carefully folded her own dress and sat down next to her. From atop a ridge at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, the Pacific Ocean stretched before them all the way to the horizon. This other man, a former friend of Keith's? Annie grinned. Actually, they were enemies. Celia stared at her, stunned by a growing realization. "We're talking personal enemy, right? Like a rival?" "Carl was my enemy, too." Celia was nearly beside herself. "Wait, don't tell me you're talking about an enemy. I mean, during the war? Annie, tell me you're not saying you're in love with a Nazi." "I never said I was in love." Celia cocked her head. Annie hadn't answered her question. "And Carl was never a Nazi. He was pretty insistent about that." Celia threw her head back. "Annie, are you saying you may have feelings for a German enemy? A member of the Third Reich?" "The war's over, Celia." "It's not that over." From the tone in Celia's voice, it was apparent that, like so many other people, she still harbored bitter feelings toward the Germans. Annie couldn't blame her. This was why Annie normally kept these feelings to herself. They sat in silence for so long that Annie figured Celia didn't want to talk about it anymore. "Did you meet him at the hospital?" Celia asked. Annie smiled. Celia was just like her sister, always thinking of her friends. "No, I met him in Belgium." "During the war?" "Yeah." "How? Wasn't it frowned upon to fraternize with the enemy?" Annie laughed. "Very much so." "Then how did you meet him?" "He shot Keith." "Whoa, Annie!" Celia glanced at the headstone. "This is too much. You're telling me this Carl, he's the one who killed my husband?" For a moment, Celia was speechless, but only for a moment. Did my sister know this, Carl?" Annie hesitated. Maybe now wasn't the best time to get into this. "How much have your parents told you about Malmedy?" she asked. "Not much. Whenever I ask, they tell me to wait until I'm older, or they change the subject, or they find something urgent to do, like cleaning out the rain gutters. It's still hard for some people to talk about the war. They keep a picture of her on a table with a candle next to it, like she was some kind of saint." Annie smiled. "Saint Mouse. Marcy would have had fun with that." "The two of you were close?" "Closer than sisters. There's something about living with someone for years on death's doorstep that has a way of bringing people together." Celia plucked a blade of grass and twirled it between her thumb and forefinger. "I still have a hard time believing my sister was over there. What was it like? Maybe if you talk about it." Annie bit her lower lip. Immediately she regretted it. Now she'd not only have to check for grass stains, she'd have to fix her lipstick as well. It was peaceful sitting here. Sunny, warm, with a blue vista stretching for as far as the eye could see. a fitting resting place for men whose last living memory was of frozen ground and mud and the mind-numbing thunder of mechanized conflict. The war seemed like a lifetime ago, a different world. "Are you sure you want to hear this?" she said. Celia settled in to listen. Where to begin? Annie took a deep breath. "Everyone told us it was the perfect time to get married," she said. "They were wrong. They didn't know that Hitler had plans that would ruin our honeymoon." Chapter 1. On the first day of our honeymoon, our leave was cancelled. We were in Bastogne with plans to continue on to Paris. "Oh, Celia, Bastogne is a gorgeous little medieval town. You really need to go there someday. There's this hotel on the Rue de Marche, the Hotel du Sud. It has a red brick exterior with a quaint, angled entryway on the corner. Inside there's a twisting stairway, narrow halls, lace curtains, and there was the most exquisite handmade quilt on the bed." We had just returned from a walking tour of the town. My feet felt like blocks of ice, and I made a beeline for the bathtub, my second bath that day. It was a luxury we didn't get often, and I was going to soak for one long, decadent hour. You have to understand, we'd been sleeping in tents on cots or the ground for 2 years. Most of us couldn't remember the last time we'd taken a bath. If you were to ask me the week before the wedding what I was looking forward to most, being married to Keith Mitchell or soaking in a bathtub, truth be told, I would have had to flip a coin. I was in the tub with bubbles up to my neck when the orders came down. We were to return to Malmedy immediately, me to the 67th Evac Hospital and Keith to HQ. From what they told us, there were reports of isolated firefights in the Ardennes forest. Canceling leaves was a precautionary measure, which only made interrupting our honeymoon that much worse. Had it been an emergency, we would have understood, but nobody was taking the threat seriously. It was the Ardennes forest, for crying out loud. This was the place where fresh recruits were sent to ease them into combat experience. Besides, this was a good 6 months after Normandy. By then, our boys had broken the back of the German army. British General Montgomery had assured everyone that Hitler no longer had the resources to mount a major offensive. Monty was headed back to England for Christmas, and General Eisenhower was off somewhere playing golf. But orders are orders. So we packed up. We weren't too happy about it, mind you. Little did we know that we were driving right into one of the biggest German offensives of the war. From the passenger's side of the command car, Mrs. Annie Mitchell stared glumly through the streaks on the windshield. The only thing uglier than her mood was the weather. She could barely see the road for the snow and fog. Keith hadn't spoken since they left Bastogne. "Think we'll make it to Paris for Christmas?" Annie asked. Christmas was 9 days away. If this recall really was a false alarm, well, she could hope. Keith grunted. "Nothing we can do about it. Orders are orders." Annie slumped. It wasn't exactly the romantic response she'd hoped for. He could have said, "Honey, I've been dreaming of you and Paris for months. Somehow, we'll get there." Or possibly, "Who needs Paris? We're married. That's all that matters to me, darling." Instead, she got, "Nothing we can do about it." Couldn't he be at least a little disappointed? Annie sighed. She was just angry that their honeymoon had been interrupted. What did she expect from him, really? She'd married Keith Mitchell, not Clark Gable, for crying out loud. She got what she deserved. She'd gone compliment fishing and reeled in an old boot. It was just like her to do something like that. She always over-romanticized things. Take their first night together. For months she'd imagined it would be this wondrous joining, an almost spiritual merging of two souls. Reality was more like field maneuvers. Face it, she told herself. Keith is Buck Rogers fighting evil with his thermic radiation projector and disintegrator gun, while you're Scarlett O'Hara during the siege of Atlanta with Tara's theme swelling in the background. He's king of the mountain, capture the flag, and mumbledy-peg.